It's going to be a hard shift to follow because after all this, and you're getting the graveyard shift, people basically have lost their minds. So I'll make it up and make it up a bit faster. My name is Stephen Fatisi. I work mainly from the Greenhouse Project, but we are an alliance of food sovereignty. So as an approach to climate change, we basically were sitting as the people who are part of the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, saying, how do we mitigate against climate change in agriculture? Because we felt that agriculture has been one of the prominent parts of the aspects of climate change, in the sense that the way commercial agriculture has been done was basically to degrade the soil and basically to cause emissions and to increase carbon emissions into the atmosphere. So as the Alliance, we thought, how do we influence and how do we make this movement, which is basically a sustainable movement in terms of agriculture, part of the national adaptive plans for local countries, and make it mostly an African thing. So for us, it was saying, why do we choose agroecology as part of the vehicle that we feel that is important for agriculture? One said, the only way for us to do that and the implementation of as a national adaptive plan is to, one, create active networks advancing agroecology as a national adaptive plans. That's why we chose that, and that's why it's been highlighted that people go on campaigns, but campaign can't sound bites. But if you twin a campaign to a project, which will be basically a champion on that campaign, then it will have a lasting experience to the population or the community that is working with. And the most important part is you need to ensure public support and actions for agroecology. That was going to be easy for us because most of the in-African communities, most of the people that are doing farming has been smallholders and family-based farming projects. And basically, they've not gone commercial like most of the, I mean, when you go up to Africa beyond the SADC regions, we don't have this vast commercial farming areas like we have in South Africa. So in that sense, it becomes easier for them to adopt a system which is basically more usable and more friendly towards their work. And then we said that for us to be, for the campaign to work, it has to be sufficiently resourced and mobilized. In the sense that if we have resources which are going to be used, like we say, we are not going to be doing campaigns, we are doing projects. So those projects become the beacon of what agroecology could be. And people in those communities will come and see how that works. And so it will basically influence the way they work in other aspects. So what was the reason for us to choose agroecology as a national adaptive plan for us? We mentioned that agroecology relies on diversity in knowledge, right? And agroecology practices are regenerative and restorative. Because as we say, commercial farming has basically degraded the soil and therefore it might have to be rehabilitated. And one of the aspects was that agroecology leads to increase in soil microbes, therefore in basically doing that restorative process that we are talking about. And then it promotes resilience through diversity, including biodiversity. When you talk about agroecology, not only does it include the soil, it includes things like weeds, because your business usual commercial farming, that approach to farming has basically disaggregated some of the flies and some of the predators, like bees. So if we go to a process whereby all the aspects of the biosphere will be sustainable, then it will be beneficial to us. Another aspect which says agricultural productions are healthy and nutritious, right? And it also promotes the decentralization of power by empowering communities. Because if you are saying we break down your commercial farms, which are 100 hectares or so, into 2-hectare small household or family household, then you have your production of food basically being sent decentralized to communities, which basically, and it ensures the integrity of the food that it will be produced. The aspect of agroecology fits in well with food sovereignty. Because then it says, food is diverse. Because each of us in this room, there are specific dishes that they like and they're grown up with. So we want to ensure the nutrients and the quality of that dish that you are basically used to. And we say that behind every food, there is a production system which the external influence is targeting both the production and consumption of food. Our food, basically, and our folklore are under threat from globalization of the food supply. That's why food sovereignty has become an order of the day. The industrialization of food production is threatening the different food production systems. Mindset intoxication, especially of young African citizens by multilateral food cooperatives, is promoting unhealthy diets. McDonald's is one example. Right? Infrastructure development on land used by communities for food production is resulting in the displacement of smallholder farmers. Because if we basically say, we are talking about real land restitution without compensation, how we do that process will basically enhance our food security. And when it comes to South Africa, I always ask this question, at what point, because people, even government people talk about food security, at what point in South Africa were you hiking for bananas and you found that they were not in the streets? So you can't talk about food security. Is your ability to access the food. The bananas were there, but probably couldn't afford them. So that's why food sovereignty, sort of food security, is a different aspect of our linguistics, of our language. To the last slide, it says, how can we produce culturally appropriate food which is nutritious and healthy without affecting the biosphere and in a just way? So that will be the question that basically we are using in when we say agroecology is the best system for us to produce our food. Because that will ensure that we have nutritious food, which is healthy, and it will be sustainable to the biosphere. That's basically the nuts and bolts of my conversation. But as we go through this process, what I would have asked us to do is, at what point do we feel that this type of approach will be appropriate for us? At what point do we feel that this type of approach will be appropriate? Because people will say, but commercial farmers have made sure that there's food security. Now you ask yourself this, would it be appropriate for you to accommodate zeros in your account, but basically desecrate the environment around you? Would it be worth it? I don't think so. So that's the message I'm giving. Thank you.
Thanks, Achimile. So Achimile attended a meeting, where was it?
In Senegal.
In Senegal, with the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, and they have presented this proposal for us to help them develop an agroecology campaign for South Africa, for Africa. And so tomorrow, I mentioned the colored pieces of paper. There's questions for you to answer about how do we promote food sovereignty and agroecology in South Africa. And we want to give that input. Well, it will inform our campaigning, but we also want to give it back to AXA. So please remember to answer those questions. All right. So Courtney and I are quickly going to launch this guide. It's quite exciting. The land guide. We're just going to go through the contents of the guide, and then we'll hand them out to you afterwards for you to look at. And then I'm not sure if there'll be time for questions, but we can engage over the course of the next 2 days if you want to ask any more questions about the guide. So just starting with the process of developing the guide, this is how we developed all our previous guides, and just touched on this. Although this one we first started with an in-depth literature search to identify key research areas, topics, researchers and practitioners. We then invited these researchers and practitioners to a workshop where the literature report was presented. We workshopped ideas, we drafted the guide, had comments, finalized, and then printed it. And this was printed by a fingerprint cooperative, so they actually do really great printing, as you'll see when you get your guide. The guide starts off with a glossary of some key terms. Here's a few of them, just looking at agroecology, biodiversity, climate justice, commons, land justice, and you can read all the definitions in the guide. And this is just to familiarize people in the workshop with these terms who might not have heard them before. Module 1 goes into the introduction and starts off with the story of our complex relationship with land. So we try to make this a very accessible guide so people can work in the communities, present it to the communities, understand what land is, understand how they interact with land. And so it starts off telling a story of our relationship with land, recognizing that over the millennia we have become disconnected from land and severed our relationship with it. And this was through forced dispossession or acts that promote profit over land. And the rest of the guide is about how to fix our relationship with the land. Integral to the land discussion is climate change. And so climate change weaves through this guide, it's even in the title. We continually show how we need sustainable land use and practices in order to promote climate justice. Not only is climate justice central, so is people's knowledge and experiences, but coupled with continuous learning about our history, alternatives and the science. So that's also in this guide, some examples of that. There are a number of exercises in the guide, asking people to reflect on past and present practices, asking them to reflect on how they're using the land, and then just discussing that. Yeah, so that's module 1. Module 2 looks at how to use the guide. So all of these tools aren't just guides that you can read, but it actually explains to a facilitator how to have a workshop. So we look at key principles for process facilitation, some guidelines for having the workshop, where you can have the workshop, what kind of tools you can use, and then explaining that there are small group and individual exercises in this tool. Module 3, Courtney's just going to go over these ones.
Okay, so module 3 is called Current Land Use Internationally and in South Africa. So in this module, the guide looks at different types of land use both internationally and South Africa. It provides examples and stats about how land is being used, highlighting some issues associated with the land, but also with data, and then also just goes over each type of land use. So the international system, this international situation is that almost 2/3 of the world's ice-free land is currently being used for agricultural settlements or is covered by forests. Globally, land is something that humans have had a huge impact on. So in the 2019 Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, it says that 75% of land surface has been significantly altered by humans, and over 85% of wetlands have been lost. The South African story is a bit more complicated because we don't really have a lot of reliable data and extensive land audits done. So there's conflicting stats and conflicting results for most of the reports. So for example, a lot of research and current reports use the stat of 82.3% of South African land is farmland, with 81.9% of that being commercial agriculture. So this is data that's currently being used in a lot of reports, but that number is actually so outdated that it's from a data set compiled by the Development Bank of South Africa, which was over 20 years ago in 1991. A 2017 report quotes it as closer to 90.8% of land being used for farmland, and a recent PLAS report defines land in South Africa as the far graph. So that's how land in South Africa is divided. The module then goes into public land, private land, residential land, agriculture and industrial commercial land, land for mining, and then communal land and protected and conservation areas. So it goes into more detail about how that works. Module 4 is South African history of land dispossession and degradation. The land debate in South Africa centers on historical injustices enacted upon Black South Africans, which dates back to colonialism. And returning the land is arguably the most vital method of addressing injustices and issues of racial injustice. So this module, the section of the guide, looks at a brief historical account of Black dispossession before and during colonialism. It also introduces the laws developed by the apartheid government relating to land and the consequences that come with them. Then it looks at the current situation of land use and the health of South Africa's land. So understanding land through history is quite difficult because history is written by those who have power, and in this case colonial power. So we don't really know enough about what was done with the land before colonialism, and this is not necessarily because that information doesn't exist or isn't there, but because much of this history was erased. This module also looks at various theories around land, such as the empty land theory, which is basically the idea that Africans moved into the interior of South Africa around the same time that Europeans did, which is of course not true because because there's evidence that around 1300 and 1450 they were clearly established and settled farming groups in the interior and uplands of KwaZulu-Natal and the Highveld. It also looks at different understandings of land, so ownership versus communal land. For Europeans, land was kind of seen as something to be conquered, something to be owned. If they owned a farm, they believed that everything on it belonged to them in its entirety. Whereas Africans have a more communal approach to land, having a relationship with the land. The model then goes into some of the laws under apartheid, such as the Areas Act and others. In terms of degradation, the South African colonial experience also entrenched a dependency on coal, which obviously persists because, as we see, South Africa is currently the 14th largest emitter of carbon in the world. And this is something we really have to take into account when we look at land reform, because how do we look at land reform but in the context of a heating world? So we need to do that keeping in mind the climate crisis and what are we using the land for. The fifth module is land and environment politics, governance and challenges. So this module speaks to the land reform policies and challenges that come along with them. Land reform policy, as most of you know, is divided into 3 strategies. So land restitution, land redistribution, and security of tenure. It then lists these policies and goes into more detail about them. It then looks at how these policies have not successfully been implemented, and this is due to a number of things, one of them being lack of political will. Some of the other key issues that the guide identifies are incorrect approaches to land reform that still promote large-scale agriculture even with land reform. Also, different understandings of communal tenure and traditional authorities, women's rights in relation to land ownership, not really taking urban land reform seriously, and all of this happening in the context of a neoliberal shrinking state. Finally, this module looks at various policies that are in place to protect the environment, including those in the Constitution. Module 6 is systemic alternatives. So given the challenges facing land reform policy, the next module deals with systemic alternatives, more specifically people's alternatives. So particularly this guide deals with the need for food sovereignty and a deep just transition. So food sovereignty, as Tumele was talking about, is about taking back the control over one's food system, and this allows a community to have the freedom to create their own food system and thus realize their right to food. A deep just transition is then about ensuring that there is an end to fossil fuels by building a new energy system, but not just an energy system. A deep just transition looks at a new energy system, a new food system, a new transport system, and a new finance system. And all of this while ensuring that the interests and rights of workers and the poor are central. The guide then also looks at other alternatives such as agroecology, land commons, customary tenure, eco-social housing, and solidarity economy. And then it ends off by profiling some projects who are currently practicing these alternatives for Africa, and some of which are being championed by people in this room.
And then there's just 2 more modules after this. So module 7 looks at a deep just transition pathway to climate justice. And so after learning about the history of land, understanding how we got to be the way we are, and the failures of current land reform policies, and thereafter learning about systemic alternatives that Courtney has mentioned, like food sovereignty, agroecology, land commons, the guide then shifts to a more activity-based solutions process. So these are solutions for rebuilding our relationship with land and nature and fighting for land justice. And this involves a number of activities or steps for the workshop group to follow, where participants are encouraged to develop a vision for the communities by mapping what they have in their communities, developing guiding principles, working through how to organize their communities, etc. And the outcome of this module is then a land justice plan that is specific to the community. And we also encourage people in this module to look at the other guides and there's links that COPEC has produced. And then the last module is a conclusion, restoring our relationship with land. This just brings it all together, highlighting that there are alternatives that do work in South Africa and in the world, and that we need to learn from these. It stresses the importance of building forums in our communities, and to start or continue the discussion about land and other issues, and to work towards climate justice through land justice. And then finally, the guide ends with a list of contacts, Annexure 1 of different organizations, COPEC and other organizations in this room, and then Annexure 2 has some additional resources. Right, I told you we'd stick to time.